A large portion of the Jewish nation has returned to its homeland, but the heart, soul, and mind of much of the Jewish nation are still in exile mode. This state of affairs must and will inevitably change. This is Torah Nation TV from Jerusalem, and we are speaking with the head of Machon Shilo, Rabbi David Bar-Hayim. Shalom, Rabbi Bar-Hayim.
Shalom.
In a recent interview, the rabbi has stated that 3 of the 4 fast days are not obligatory. How does the rabbi explain the fact that the Ramban, who has been cited by the Tur and all the later poskim, says that all 4 fast days are obligatory nowadays?
What I mentioned in an earlier interview was that the Talmud Bavli in Rosh Hashanah Daf Yod Het 18a and b, which discusses this matter, states that there are 3 possible situations, historical situations, realities in which the Jewish people may find themselves, and based on that reality, the halakha changes accordingly. The Talmud discusses 3 possibilities: shalom, shemad, and en shemad wa en shalom. Shalom is the situation, in theory, shall we say, where everything is as it should be. The Jewish people are in their homeland and living under their own sovereignty. There is a mikdash, a temple, etc. Shemad is the exact opposite, where the Jewish people are ruled over by others, they are being persecuted, they are being prevented from living a Jewish way of life, such as being forbidden to study Torah, being forbidden to keep the Shabbat, Brit Milah, etc. That is the situation of Shemad. This also would include warfare in the simple sense of being attacked and destroyed physically by an enemy. And En Shemad wa En Shalom is many types of historical reality which fit into the middle ground, somewhere between those 2 extremes. And I pointed out that in the words of a number of sources from the time of the Geonim, that is to say going back 1300, 1200, 1100 and up to 1000 years ago, in the words of Rabbeinu Hananel, for example, on that sugya, we find that they describe their situation as in their time as being one of en shemad wa en shalom. That is to say, the situation was considered by them to be an intermediate type of historical reality in which the situation is neither very good nor very bad, and therefore those 3 fast days are optional. Furthermore, these sources, these Geonim, and also the Ramban, as I pointed out in his Perush on the Mishnah, in his commentary on the Mishnah, there writes that this is an individual choice. That is to say, when the situation is neither very good nor very bad, en shalom or en shemad, then it is up to the individual to decide whether he wishes to fast on those 3 fast days or not. Those are the words and the opinions, the view and understanding of the Geonim, Rabbeinu Hananel, and the Ramban. With regards to the Ramban, who, as you correctly point out, first of all, one has to mention here, was one of the greatest of the Rishonim, without a doubt. Second of all, the Ramban wrote a very, very important halachic work on Ilchot Aveluth, everything to do with mourning and death and burial and all related topics, and therefore also the topic of Aveluth Yeshana, that is to say, forms of mourning and commemorating disasters and tragedies in Am Yisrael's past. The Ramban wrote a book on all this entitled Torat Ha'adam, and this is a classic work of the Ramban, in which he shows his great power and strength and wisdom and knowledge in all areas of Torah. And this work of his became the standard text when it comes to these particular halachot, on which all subsequent poskim base themselves by and large. And it's therefore true that the Tur and many other poskim quote that which the Ramban writes on this matter. So we are also going to quote from the Ramban, and we'll see on what points and for what reasons the Ramban differs with the views of the Geonim and the Ramban. So in this edition of Torat Hadam, the Rav Shevel edition, page Resh Mem Gimel, 243, Ramban quotes the Talmud, as we said before, and then he goes on to say, Yesh Shalom, Hainu B'zman Shebeth HaMikdash Kayam. In a situation where the Mikdash stands, That is how the Ramban defines the concept of Yesh Shalom. These days are no longer days of fasting and mourning, but quite the opposite, days of rejoicing. En Shalom, כגון בזמן חורבן ואין שרה במקום ידוע בישראל. On the other hand, Shemad, we also know, we explained what Shemad is, a situation of severe persecution. If on the other hand, it is a situation of En Shalom, כגון בזמן חורבן, such as a time when there is no Mikdash, ואין שרה במקום ידוע בישראל, and there is no particular place on the planet where Jews are being severely persecuted and forced to abandon their Judaism. In that situation, which is the situation of En Shalom or En Shemad, Rasul Rov Yisrael, if most of the Jewish people decide v'niskemu shelo lehitanoth, not to fast, then they are not required to fast on that day. Rasul Rov Sibur lehitanoth, if on the other hand most of the Jewish people decide that they should fast in that situation, then they do fast. I pause here for one moment and explain, in order to explain that here the Ramban is taking a different approach from that of the Gaonim. The first thing to point out here, I believe, is to say that the Ramban apparently did not see the statements of the Gaonim on this matter. I say this because the Ramban of all Rishonim is known for always quoting the Gaonim and very often, almost always agreeing with them. And here, if he does not do so, this implies very clearly that he did not see the words of the Gaonim. As opposed to the Gaonim, who write that in the intermediate situation of En Shemad wa En Shalom, where the situation is neither perfect nor disastrous, such as the time of the Gaonim themselves, who wrote these words, they describe in their own historical reality as being one of En Shemad wa En Shalom, and therefore they say it is an individual decision for every individual Jew to decide if he wishes to fast on any of these particular days, because they are not therefore obligatory fast days in such a situation. They are optional fast days, and therefore it is a personal decision. The Ramban, on the other hand, says, no, this is a national decision where the Jewish people as a whole, or a majority thereof, have to agree to do either one or the other thing. This is a clear deviation from what the Gaonim and the Rambam also says. There are a number of difficulties with what the Ramban here says. For example, the fact that at a time when the Jewish people are dispersed all over the world, living in hundreds and thousands, in fact, of communities, with hundreds and perhaps thousands of Batei Din and Chachamim in different parts of the world, how is it possible that the Jewish people would be able to sit down, analyze the situation, the historical reality in which they find themselves, and reach some kind of national consensus as to how they should behave in that particular time, in that particular generation? It is quite impossible to imagine how this could be done in the time of galuth, of exile, of dispersion. It would be difficult enough to do such a thing, I think, even if the Jewish people were all to be concentrated in one area. If there were a Sanhedrin and all the Jewish people lived in Eretz Yisrael, one can perhaps understand how such a decision might be reached. But otherwise, it is very difficult to understand such a position, particularly if you take into account the difficulty, sometimes impossibility of communication between distant communities in real time, and one sage being aware of the view and the opinion of another sage, and also if one takes into account the fact that it may be the case that in one particular country, in the exile, Jews are suffering severe persecution, whereas Jews in another country are not at all, are in fact doing rather well. Therefore, it would be quite natural for those Jews in different parts of the world to adopt a different attitude, perhaps, to these days. So that whole description and understanding of the Ramban is difficult to, I think, to accept, and certainly difficult to understand, and it, without a doubt, contradicts the words of the Gaonim and the words of the Rambam, who describe this matter as being one of an individual person's choice and not some kind of national or even communal decision. That is the first difference between the Ramban and the Gaonim. Furthermore, the Ramban continues, based on what we just read, that this is a national or at least a communal kind of decision. وَأَخْشَوْا كَفَرَ سُوَنَاهُ لِهِثْعَنُوث وَكِبْلُوا عَلَيْهِمْ. And nowadays, majority of the Jewish people have decided and have it is their wish and is their custom, has been for a long time, to fast. لَفِخَخْ أَسُولَ يَحِيدْ لِفْرَوْسْ گِدْرَانَ. And now, therefore, it is not permissible for the individual to do otherwise, to conduct himself otherwise. In other words, the Ramban says, as a corollary of what we just explained, seeing that this is a national or a communal type of decision, if the nation has decided that they are going to fast on these days, then, and this has been the fixed custom for a long time, therefore it is no longer possible for the individual to act differently. So this is a new perspective based on the Ramban's initial understanding on this decision, of this decision being a national one rather than an individual one. Second of all, the Ramban goes on to say, "B'chol sheken b'doroth halalu," and even more so, this is even more obviously true and correct at the present time, in our generation, says the Ramban, "Shehare ba'avonothenu," because we know in our sins, or because of our sins, "Sharabu saroth b'Yisrael wa'en shalom," the situation in all of Am Yisrael and the majority of the places in the world where Jews live is one of en shalom, where the situation is very dire. And therefore, we are all required to fast on these days, all these fast days. So says the Ramban. Now, what do some people do, reading those words of the Ramban, which are also quoted in the Torah and other well-known and authoritative works of halakha? They read these words that in our generations this is a chovah, and it is certainly not possible to choose not to fast, and they assume that this somehow applies to the present time. However, what these people are forgetting and not taking note of is that just as when the Gaonim wrote 1300 or 1100 years ago, Badorot halalu, in our generations, at this time, this is how things stand, and therefore it is not a chovah to fast. Exactly in the same way, when the Ramban writes some centuries later, in the 13th century, that in our generations, in my time, says the Ramban, the situation is dire, and there is shamad in many parts of the Jewish world, and therefore it is a requirement to fast. People are forgetting this was written, that's in very simple terms, approximately 700 or 650 years ago at least. Whereas we have to look at the situation based on the reality of today. In other words, the historical realities between the time of the Gaonim and even Rabbeinu Hananel, who lived 1,000 years ago, who writes explicitly that in my time, says Rabbeinu Hananel, in our period, the situation is one of en shalom or en shmad, and therefore these fast days are not obligatory. Just as that was true in the time of Rabbeinu Hananel, so was it equally true 300 odd years later, or 250 years later, in the time of the Ramban. So was it equally true that the historical reality had changed, most definitely for the worse, and the Jewish people in many parts of the world, perhaps one could say without exaggeration, almost all parts of the Jewish world, this was true in North Africa, this was true in parts of the Middle East, this was true in Asia Minor, this was true in Europe, from the time of the First Crusade, which began in the year 1096 and ended in the year 1099. In other words, up until that time, the historical reality had been, generally speaking, reasonable and livable from the perspective of the Jews in most parts of the world. From that time onwards, both in the Christian world and in the Muslim world, things began to deteriorate. In the Christian world, the situation began to deteriorate severely from the time of the First Crusade, and this continued for a number of centuries, leading up to the expulsion of the Jews from England and the expulsion of the Jews from France, and eventually the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, etc., as we know. And also in the Muslim world, the situation began to deteriorate, and this is exactly why, for instance, the Rambam and his family had to flee from Spain and eventually ended up in Mitzrayim because of severe religious persecution, something that had not existed a few generations prior to that time. So the historical reality clearly changed, and therefore the Ramban and the Tur, etc., living in such times, wrote what they wrote, and for their time what they wrote was entirely 100% correct and accurate and in keeping with the statements of the Talmud in Masechet Rosh Hashanah. However, we are now, Baruch Hashem, 6 or 7 centuries down the line. The situation has changed, not just somewhat for the better, but in fact the situation has been turned around almost entirely. For example, I would ask very simply for anyone to point out today, anywhere on the globe, where can we find today a situation, even one country, where there is any sizable Jewish population that is being severely religiously persecuted? I'm not claiming there is no anti-Semitism in the world. There most certainly is, but it is not the case that Jews living in Europe or even in North Africa, even countries today like Morocco, it is not the case that Jews cannot practice their Judaism or being forced to convert to Islam or to Christianity, or the Jews are being burnt at the stake, or that Jews are being interrogated by the Spanish Inquisition. None of this is going on today in no country with which I am familiar where there is any sizable Jewish community whatever. In other words, the situation is entirely one where there is no shemad in the world, Baruch Hashem, at this time at all. This has been the case for some time, and is reasonable to assume will also continue to be the case for some time. Of course, no one can predict the future precisely, but as things stand today, that is the reality. This is the exact opposite, the mirror image of what existed in the time of the Ramban, the time of the Tur, in general in the medieval period, in the time of the Rishonim in Europe and in the Middle East and in North Africa. And therefore, the words of the Ramban and the Tur, and therefore all the assumptions of Poskim who lived at that time and in subsequent generations where such persecutions continued. One only has to mention the Khmelnytsky massacres in the Ukraine and all the pogroms in Eastern Europe and in Central Europe, in Germany throughout the Middle Ages, the 14th century, the 15th century, etc. One only has to mention these historically well-known facts to understand, to appreciate that the situation then and the situation today cannot even be remotely compared. And therefore, those statements which were very true at that time, halachically, based on the statements of Chazal, are today entirely inoperative and not relevant.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.